All right, what is up, everyone? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com, the official playoff version of this. We're into the real playoffs, the National League Divisional Series. The Dodgers sweep the Brewers 2-0. Daniel, how do you feel? Do you feel like the playoffs are just about to start? Do you feel like something has already been accomplished? Where are you at in this thing?
It's definitely been a weird start to the postseason so far. We're not used to these wild card series. The intensity was pretty high. Obviously, you could feel like that the importance of the games, but at the same time, it didn't quite feel like a full-on playoff games.
Yeah.
Just only 3-game series is kind of weird. If you lose one game, your backs are already against the wall. So definitely didn't like that. But luckily, the Dodgers were able to take care of business, so there wasn't too much stress. And now we're on to the NLDS.
Yeah. And Kershaw even said it's kind of like it feels like it's just starting, but I imagine that it was 2-0, so maybe the Dodgers didn't feel the stress that they thought they were going to stress, and we'll get into that in a moment. But anyways, it is an interesting place to be. And I'll just throw this out there. I hinted on in our last show that I wasn't sure my availability because we were about to have a child. But we had our third daughter on Tuesday night, and I'll point out my third daughter is currently undefeated in life. The Dodgers are 2-0, the Lakers are 2-0, and even my soccer team, Arsenal, won in penalty kicks in a meaningless tournament. But so she's 5-0. We're going to try and keep that streak going on Sunday night with the Lakers. I feel pretty good about the Lakers side of things. We'll talk about the Dodgers here in a moment. But so if I start dozing off halfway through, or you see me drinking my iced tea, you'll understand we're like 4 days into 3 kids versus 2 adults. So, but here's the plan for tonight. We're going to do a recap. We're going to talk a little bit about that Brewers series, 2-0 Dodgers. It wasn't totally comfortable, I don't think, but it also wasn't maybe super stressful. There wasn't any major comebacks or high stress moments necessarily. And then we'll spend most of our time tonight talking about the series coming up. What does it look like logistically in the bubble in Texas? Some notes and some thoughts on the Padres. We'll talk about the pitching rotation. I think that's where the most fun will be had. We'll talk about if there are any roster changes that you or I are predicting. And then we'll do the same thing we did last time. The Dodgers lose this series if, or the Dodgers win this series if, and then we'll end with our predictions. And so let's start at the top, Daniel, with just a recap. The Dodgers win 2-0. From you, as you look back on those 2 games, now both you and I were a little freaked out about a 3-game series, small sample size. Who knows what's going to happen? The Dodgers take care of business. As you look back, what are a couple positives that you took from that series, sort of headlines for you, things that you feel good about moving forward?
Yeah. Like you said, they were able to take care of business. That's the important thing. They didn't look like they were anywhere close to being their best. But my first positive, unquestionably, is Clayton Kershaw. He looked incredible in his start. He won 8 shutout innings, only 3 hits allowed. He was never really threatened at all.
Yeah.
They got a guy on base here, a guy on base there. He struck out 13, which is a career high for him in the postseason.
On
And he kept
93
his pitch
pitches. 93 pitches.
Yeah,
Sorry, you were just about to say it, but 13 strikeouts on 93 pitches is absolutely bonkers.
Yeah. I tweeted I wanted to see him back out there for the 9th, but I understand it. It was good to see Gratterall get some work too, but it was a great season for Clayton Kershaw, but we also kind of didn't know exactly what we were gonna get from him in the postseason. But if this is the guy we're getting, then that's obviously great news. He was as dominant as can be. His velocity was up, and I think it's just a product of the shortened season. He's used to having 152 innings, 200 innings under his belt going into the postseason. This year he's only at 60 innings or whatever it is. So he looks fresh. He looks great, and I expect more of the same from him moving forward.
Yeah, no, and I'll just add 5 hard hit balls he allowed all game. So he was dominant. Do you push it? It was a 3-0 game. Do you push it and try and put him back out for the 9th? Ultimately, they won. Gratterall got 3 out, so I think that kind of worked itself out. But it was definitely dominant. It was definitely, I think Tim Kirchin was saying it was, as good as he's seen Clayton Kershaw look in years. Outside of his no-hitter, it was kind of the peak Clayton Kershaw, which was nice. Yep. And we'll see if that moves ahead going forward. What do you got for your second big takeaway positive?
My second one I kind of mentioned already. It's 2 bullpen guys that I thought looked really good. The first one is Brusdar Gratterall. It was cool to see him get a save opportunity there, even though in theory Kenley should have been available. He had only pitched the night before. So, but in a 3-0 game, it was good to see Dave Roberts. I guess you could add as a positive in there as well. He went with someone other than Kenley
Yeah.
Jansen for a save situation. Got some good experience for Gratterall, and he was able to come through and close it out. So that was really good. And then the other bullpen guy I was really impressed with was Julio Urias in Game 1.
Yeah.
He's another guy that was kind of inconsistent all year long, so we weren't exactly sure what we were going to get out of him. But he looked as good as he's looked all season. Maybe the key for him is just not pitching the first inning, because other than that, he's been pretty great all year. So we'll see what role they're going to use him in moving forward, and we'll get into that discussion later in the show, I'm sure. But he looked great, so now I honestly feel comfortable if Julio's on the mound, whether he's starting or relieving. So credit to him for coming in, and he went 3 innings, which was huge because Buehler could only go 4 because they want to monitor the blister issue. So that was big for them.
Yeah, I mean, the Gratterall thing was big for me. This is a guy who just turned 22. He hits 101.5 on the gun at one point, and the moment just didn't look too big for him. I mean, he's a 22-year-old. Many people think if he doesn't become a starter, which the Dodgers still seem to be leaving the door open to, that this is a guy that could be the closer of the future, and in that moment. And so for me, I mean, I'll say this is a positive. It's not specifically about Gratterall, but it is the closer situation with this caveat. In Game 1, Kenley Jansen was a mess. We're going to talk about that. But Gratterall was warming. I mean, you and I have both talked about my thing with Jansen. Now, this has changed, and we'll get to this in a moment, is I'm fine with him being the closer as long as the leash is short. And for the first time, I mean, do you ever remember a time when Jansen had yet to blow the game and they had someone warming in the bullpen? I can't remember it ever, and yet it happened. Now, it's interesting that it's Gratterall, but it was Gratterall that was warming. Trinan had already pitched that day, so maybe that was part of it. I thought Jake McGee could have been a guy there. They had Victor Gonzalez warming in Game 2, so some of those names, but I'll say the positive is, A, they had a guy warming in Game 1, and B, in Game 2, they had a different guy close it out. Now, as you said, in theory, Jansen easily could have pitched the next day. Dave Roberts said before the game that he was unlikely to pitch because of workload, which, I mean, workload is kind of a crock when you consider his wasn't a heavy workload, and he hadn't pitched in like 5 days before that. But Roberts, I believe, said after the game that they're going to mix up their closing, that it's not about Jansen losing the job, but they just want to give teams a good look. And so for me, that is the positive headline of all of this, is that for a team like the Dodgers to be able to say you don't know who you're going to see in the ninth, I think is a massive advantage. And not only just saying it, but actually coming out in Game 2 and proving it. So I think for me, that was huge, is just seeing Roberts' willingness to sort of loosen the reins on the closer position, loosen Jansen's grip on it, whether it's warming a guy up in Game 1 or actually changing closers in Game 2.
Yeah, and that's something I've kind of been preaching all season long in this show, that I'd rather see no specific roles in the bullpen and go by leverage, and it was good to see that even though Roberts kind of backed Kenley before Game 2, he said that he went back and looked at the film, and Kenley actually looked pretty good, which we'll get into more later. But it's fine. I don't mind him backing Kenley in public. But then when it came time, push came to shove, he went with Gratterall for the save opportunity. So I thought that was good to see that he's willing to, deviate from Kenley, and it got Gratterall some big time experience. So now if he's in a similar spot moving forward, he's been there before.
Yeah, I was thrilled after Game 1 that Roberts came out and basically said his stuff didn't look good. It's like, oh my gosh, this is really happening. He's seeing what all the rest of us are seeing. Apparently he had 3 bottles of wine and then watched the tape and thought things looked different. I mean, I guess if your vision is sort of blurry, then maybe the cutter was moving as his head moved a little bit or something like that. But I don't know what he possibly could have seen there. I think that's just him realizing he was pretty harsh after Game 1, although true, and saying, hey, I got to come back out and be a little more positive. But so that's my first one, is the willingness there. And number 2 is just Mookie Betts. I mean, this is no surprise. He was 3 for 7 with a walk in the series. He had 3 doubles, including the big one in Game 2. But it's just the Dodgers we're not used to our best players actually hitting baseballs in October. We're just not used to the best players coming through. And so to see Mookie Betts do it, especially in Game 2, was huge. And just, it sets the tone, and we'll get to in a minute. He was kind of alone on an island there as far as guys who produced, other than King Austin Barnes. But it was just nice to see a guy where it's like, Mookie's up in a big spot, boom, hits a double, comes through, Dodgers win. So that was the other positive for me. I'll add just the fact that they swept, the fact that they didn't sort of slip up. They scraped it out. It wasn't pretty, but these are the types of games that you need to win. Now, hopefully you're not in a ton of them. They were in 2 sort of scrape it out situations, which isn't ideal when you're playing a team under 500, but they did win. So there is a lot of positive here to take out of this that I can think of. Anything else besides those that kind of just jumps to mind? I mean, again, they swept, so there's a lot here. It was also 2 games, but any other big things for you?
Just to add on to what you said about Mookie, it just feels like whenever he's at the plate, he's so calm
Yeah.
and cool and collected that it just makes me feel that way as well. Like I just feel like whenever he's up, I feel like he's going to come through in a big spot. So it's good to have at least one guy in the lineup like that. Overall, it wasn't a huge series for the offense. They did what they had to do. But they were facing a pretty good pitching staff. When talking about the Brewers, we know that their strength is not their offense, it's their pitching. And even though Corbin Burns didn't pitch and also Devin Williams was a late scratch, they still have good pitchers over there. Woodruff looked really good for 4 innings in game 2, and they finally were able to get to him. They strung together some good at-bats. So that was good to see. But overall, it wasn't a huge series for the offense. But when they're pitching as well as they did, that they did what they needed to do.
Yeah, and now switching to concerns, I know I'm gonna leave the one on a tee for you to take as far as concerns coming out of this series. But you kind of touched on what struck out to me. Dodgers hitting needs to be better. I mean, they were able to survive, and you said, hey, the Brewers pitching staff isn't bad. Yes, Josh Hader pitched 1 inning. Brandon Woodruff pitched 5 or 6 innings. Aside from that, I mean, Suter came out and was atrocious. They got to the bullpen immediately. And yet, in spite of that, the Dodgers' 3-4-5 hitters, Justin Turner, Max Muncy, and Will Smith, were a combined 0 for 19. Turner was 0 for 8. Muncy was 0 for 5 with 4 strikeouts, and Will Smith was 0 for 6. So at some point, the better pitching is coming. We're going to talk about the Padres here in a moment. We don't know if it's this series or in the future, but it will definitely be better, I guess, regardless of what happens with Lamet and Clevenger to some degree. But the bats have to get going. Now, Justin Turner's a guy historically I'm not worried about. Will Smith historically has been pretty clutch in his limited sample size. He doesn't appear to be a guy that gets freaked out in his own head too much like some of the other young hitters. Muncy has been terrible. I mean, at some point, he's got to be the 8 or 9 hitter. At some point, he's got to drop down the lineup because 0 for 5 with 4 strikeouts isn't cutting it. But to me, that's a concern. Turner 0 for 8, Muncy 0 for 5, Smith 0 for 6. That has to be better.
Yeah, I'd probably move Muncy down in the lineup a little bit. He didn't look too good, and I think just moving him down takes some pressure off of him. He doesn't feel like he's got to be, the cleanup guy, the guy to drive in all the runs. So I think he could benefit from moving down. But you're right. And this is something we've seen in past Octobers as well. And it seems to be whenever the Dodgers lose, this seems to be their downfall. Is their great lineup, their star offensive players just don't come through when they have to. And even looking back to game 1 at the beginning when they're working walks off Suter and having great at bats, he was all over the place. But it just didn't feel like they broke through as much as they should have. You know, Edwin Rios hit that ball down the line that almost was a grand slam, and that would have just completely broke the game wide open. But it just never happened. They only scored a few runs, and then eventually it got close because Arcia hit that home run. So I'd like to see them get going offensively, score some runs early against the Padres. But yeah, it's definitely a huge concern moving forward, just because we've seen it in so many Octobers before.
Yeah, I think I tweeted after the first inning of game 1, I was like, I don't know if I should be happy or sad that the Dodgers are up 2-0, because on one hand, it's like the offense has historically been so bad in the postseason that you're just glad they scored. On the flip side, to have that like 5 walks and score 2 runs was absolutely dreadful. As you said, Rios was really close. But I mean, at the end of the day, it was enough. So the hitters have to come through. The Dodgers won both the games, so we didn't get a big sample size. They didn't really need to come through in big moments because a guy like Mookie did his job. But that's concern number 1. But I think that's concern 1B for me. You want to touch on the obvious one. So the biggest concern for you was what?
Yeah, it was Kenley. Anyone who watched him pitch in game 1 will agree. He did not look great at all. He got too quick. He was facing the bottom of the order. That's why, like, going into the outing, I wasn't really concerned. So he got 2 quick outs, fine. His velocity was absolutely concerning. At some point, his cutter was at 86, 87 miles an hour, and his command was off too. So if you want to at least have one of the two. Like if your velo's down, at least be able to put the ball where you want. He didn't have either. He got lucky. Yelich bailed him out a little bit, swung at a ball that wasn't even close to the strike zone. So for me, that was the biggest concern. The Brewers lineup is nothing to be worried about. But now we're facing a Padres lineup that has a lot more threats in it. And if we're going to be moving on, we're going to be facing other lineups that have
Yeah.
a lot of threats in it as well. So I'm definitely concerned about Kenley. But at the same time, Dave Roberts going to Gratterall the next night shows me that he's willing to get away from Kenley a little bit if he has to. And the fact that Gratterall was also up, loosening up in game one when Kenley was in, that was a good sign as well. So I think behind the scenes, Dave Roberts and the Dodgers staff, they see what we're all seeing. I mean, how could they not?
Yeah.
I don't really care what he says to the media. It doesn't really accomplish anything to criticize Kenley publicly right now. You want him to remain confident at the
Yeah.
very least. So I'm definitely concerned about Kenley, and hopefully if he's out there throwing 86 again, then he only lasts 3 batters and they're on to the next guy.
I mean, that's a strange thing to me is like, could nobody figure that out in the bullpen? Like, is the bullpen coach not sitting there being like, hey, Dave, like he's touching 87 on the gun with his cutter tonight. I mean, like it just feels now, what do you do at that point? He's obviously not throwing full speed before the game, but I mean, if it's the top of the ninth and he's warming and he's touching 86, 87, like it feels like that's a type of thing where it's like, and maybe that call was made and maybe that's why Gratterall was warming after 1 out, but it just feels like at some point you just sort of call that before it actually happens. Like the Dodgers can't afford to let Kenley blow a save before they make a change here. And that's my concern is, while things are trending in the right direction, Roberts is starting to do and say things that are better, he's not all the way there yet, and that definitely concerns me.
No, yeah, and I agree 100% on the bullpen thing. Obviously, he himself is not going to say he doesn't feel good. He's a competitor. He's going to want to go in there. So it's up to the bullpen catcher, the bullpen coach. They're watching him, and we've talked about it all along. You could tell within 1 or 2 batters when Kenley's pitching if he has it or not. So I think the quick leash will be important. At the very least, have someone loosening up just in case, because you don't want to get in a situation where he walks a guy and then 2 straight hits or something and the base is loaded before you even blinked, and now you don't even have anyone who's even throwing yet. So it's important to be proactive with that type of stuff, and that's all I could really ask for, really. I don't expect them to not use Kenley at all moving forward. He's still a big part of this bullpen, and I think he still can be successful. But I don't think he has to be the guy that they lean on. There's so many different options.
Yeah.
So many guys that have been great all year. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, we've touched on it before. The hard part for Roberts, I think, is there's not a Devin Williams type who has just come out of nowhere and been utterly dominant. They've got Trinan, they've got Gratterall, who both are really, really good, but both their strikeout numbers are really, really low, which is something you need. Now, if you want strikeouts, you could go a direction like Jake McGee, but I mean, this is a guy who was cut by the Rockies like 4 months ago. So it's sort of like Jansen isn't great, but there's not somebody screaming at you to say, this is this person's job, which I think is what we're talking about. Just play the matchups. Are there guys that, against the Padres, I could see a guy like Trinan who's got a nasty sinker ball and keeps the ball on the ground getting a lot more playing time versus a guy like Jansen who kind of tends to leave the ball up and could be prone to the home run ball. So it's definitely something to monitor. Again, hopefully Jansen doesn't have to blow a game before we get down that road, but we'll see what happens. And so let's look ahead then. We've got the Padres. The Padres lose game 1 to the Cardinals. They come back and they win games 2 and game 3. And before we kind of dig into the Padres themselves, let's talk nuts and bolts of the series. It's a 5-game series, potentially, 5 consecutive days, no days off. The Dodgers on Friday flew to Texas because they will be playing in the Rangers ballpark. They'll be sequestered in a bubble in a hotel in Dallas. It's just one thing I've been thinking about. This idea of a bubble, this idea of being in a neutral site, this idea of just sort of everything being different. Do you think this helps the Dodgers versus the Padres? Do you think it hurts the Dodgers, or do you think it's sort of such a new unknown thing that there's just no way to know?
Yeah, I think it's kind of neutral. The Dodgers would have, if this was a normal year, the Dodgers would have home field advantage. So they would have 3 true home games at Dodger Stadium. So they're losing out on that. But at the same time, they played in this Texas stadium earlier this season. They did well there. Now the Padres also played there as well, so there's no clear advantage there. Whereas if they would have played the Cardinals, it's a brand new stadium this year, so that would be the first time the Cardinals are ever playing there. So I think that's neutral as well. The fact that the Dodgers and Padres have both played there. Of course, when the Padres were there, we had the infamous Tatis 3-0 grand slam that Chris Woodward got mad at. So he likes that stadium. He hit a few homers there, but I think one thing that also cannot be overlooked is just the whole bubble thing and the chemistry aspect of it. We saw it with the NBA. The teams who weren't as close off the field or off the court, that didn't really like hanging out together, didn't really do good in the NBA bubble. Whereas teams like the Lakers and the Heat, who are close, tight knit units, really thrived in
Yeah.
there. So I think that's an advantage for the Dodgers as well. That they seem to like each other. They're a close bunch. Although the same could be said with the Padres. So
Yeah.
everything I've kind of mentioned is ended up coming out kind of neutral. So I guess overall it's a loss for the Dodgers because they're losing home field advantage. But I think if they play their game, they should still be able to take care of business. At the end of the day, it's just baseball.
Yeah, on one hand, it's like, hey, the Dodgers all like each other. On the other hand, you can't watch a Padres game and come away with any idea other than those guys might like each other more than any other team in
Yes.
baseball. So, the one thing for me, I wonder aloud about is the veteran leadership piece. The Dodgers have been there before. The Dodgers have guys like Kershaw and Jansen and even Betts and Turner who are sort of clubhouse leaders. The Padres, it's more a lot of younger guys. You do have someone like Eric Hosmer. But besides Hosmer, I mean, none of these guys have really been there. Machado, sort of, maybe. I mean, their pitching staff is young. I mean, they've got Rosenthal, who's been there as a closer, but I mean, he's brand new to the team and is sort of okay and not great. So that's one thing I wonder about. The routine is all out of whack. It's a brand new thing. Does that favor a team with experience, or does that neutralize it and say none of these guys have done it before? So the fact that Justin Turner or Clayton Kershaw has been to the World Series twice, who cares, because it's going to be so different. I'm with you. I think it's just too much to know. Obviously, not having home field advantage is a big deal. But once it gets to Dodgers and Padres, these two teams, I'm not sure there's an advantage. Some matchups there might be, but for me, it's not much. So let's get into the actual series itself then. Here's some notes about the Padres, just looking back at both the season and the last series. So in the last series, the Padres, if you even just were tracking on ESPN, I mean, it's a team that scored 19 runs in 3 games. They allowed 16, even with a shutout in game 3, they still allowed 16. The biggest question for the Padres coming, yeah,
Cardinals offense,
to
I should add.
to a very bad Cardinals offense. Totally true. And obviously the big question for the Padres is Dinelson Lamet and Mike Clevenger, their 2 best starters, were both out for the wild card series. The Padres have not said whether or not they'll be in the NLDS. They are hopeful they will be, but I think there is some skepticism. Obviously, if you leave them out of the wild card series, it's hard to imagine 3-5 days is going to make a big difference. But they're hopeful on both fronts, which is a good thing because they started 2 starters, Chris Paddock and Zach Davies, who combined for 4 innings pitched and 9 earned runs. So they could use some help on that front. As far as in the series itself, Fernando Tatis Jr., who has been their best player most of the season, at the end of the year has the best numbers. I mean, the guy hit 455. He slugged almost 1.1. He had 2 home runs. Will Myers had 2 home runs. Manny Machado and Eric Hosmer each got 1. So offensively, they're clicking. On the pitching side, they used 8 pitchers in game 1, 9 pitchers in games 2, 9 pitchers in game 3. Their 8th and 9th inning guys, Pomerantz and Rosenthal, both pitched 3 days in a row. Both of them allowed 2 runs. So it's an interesting thing to look at their box scores. On a season level, offensively, they're very good. 4th in home runs, 3rd in runs, 2nd in run differential. Their starting pitching was really good. Again, question mark in this series, but they were 6th in WAR, 3rd in ERA, 7th in strikeout per 9 innings. Their bullpen was a little rougher, 10th in WAR, 14th in ERA, 9th in K per 9 innings. They finished with the second best record. Of course, the headline of all of this, the Dodgers won 6 out of 10 against the Padres. So we know it's a very good team. They had the second best record in the National League. They have a great offense. The starting pitching is a question mark. When you think about the Padres, is Clevenger and Lamet, is that kind of the headline that sort of steals everything else as you're looking into it? Or is there more to the story that maybe isn't getting noticed?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the pitching with the Padres. Like you just mentioned, they threw 8 guys in all three of the games, so they're already coming in with their pitching a little taxed. And I think when we going back to the advantage aspect, I think a big advantage for the Dodgers in this series is that they're playing 5 straight days.
Yeah.
There's no travel, so there's not any off days. So we saw the Padres pitching staff was kind of toast at the end of a 3-game wild card series. So imagine adding 2 more games
Yeah,
on
that's a
top
good
of
point.
that. And that's why I think getting either Clevenger or Lamet or possibly both back is huge for them, just because they need some sort of starters that could actually give them innings. Chris Paddock and Zach Davies, they were both fine regular season pieces, but those aren't the guys you want
Yeah.
starting games 1 and 2 of a postseason series. Lamet and Clevenger are by far their two best pitchers, and are two of the best pitchers in the
Yeah.
league when they're at their best. Which, that's a big question mark though. So even if they do pitch, we don't know what we're going to be getting out of them. They're dealing with arm injuries. Those don't just go away and you're great and can throw 100 pitches a week later. So that's going to be something to monitor, whether they're even on the roster or not, whether they're starting or maybe just high leverage bullpen guys because they
Yeah.
can't throw a lot. So we'll see with that. But I do think the Dodgers pitching staff is a lot better equipped to get through a series of 5 straight days than the Padres,
Yeah.
for sure.
No, I think that's a great point. And I mean, even if Lamet and Clevenger can pitch, you still got Paddock and Davies in game 3 and 4, and they got to figure out what they're going to do in game 5 because neither of those guys is coming back on short rest. I think the Dodgers have this goes from a really good to a below average starting pitching staff, depending on if those guys are healthy. Offensively, I mean, I think you would probably take the Padres offense over the Dodgers offense, maybe not on paper, sort of in theory, but just based on what has just happened for the last week. And even just looking back and saying, do you trust some of these Dodger hitters in big moments? I mean, the Padres haven't been there, but in some ways that works to their advantage. So it'll be interesting to see if the Dodgers can neutralize some of those bats, get a slump going. I mean, we saw Tatis at the end of the year was in a dreadful slump. So maybe if he gets an 0 for 4 in game 1 and strikes out a couple times in games 2, maybe that builds on it. But I think on paper, it's probably the best matchup of any in all of the postseason going into this. I mean, you've got, again, the number 1 run differential versus number 2, best in the National League versus second best. The Dodgers totally get hosed by the fact that they have to play the Padres in round 2.
Right.
But you knew you were going to have to go through them at some point anyways, so there's no sense in complaining about that. The biggest question, I think, shifting to the Dodgers is what the roster looks like, specifically what the pitching staff looks like. There was a lot of debate going into the last series about Walker Buehler and Clayton Kershaw, who pitches game 1, who pitches game 2, and even more so maybe who pitches game 3. Now, we never had to find out who game 3 was going to be. It wouldn't have been Julio Urias. It would have been either Gonsolin or May based on the fact that Urias was used in game 1 and neither of those other guys appeared because the Dodgers didn't need help. And so now we come to a series. There's plenty of time off because the Dodgers swept in 2. Anybody can be available on full rest. The Dodgers have to play 5 games in 5 days. And so the question is where the rotation shakes out. And here's what I've got. I think Clayton Kershaw should start game 1 for the Dodgers. And here's why. First, I think he's the best pitcher they have. I think he's the most reliable pitcher they have. Buehler at his peak might be better, but he's not at his peak. And Kershaw is at his peak. Like this is peak Kershaw that we're getting in 2020. So that's the first reason. I think he's, simply put, reason number 1, he's their best pitcher. Number 2, while the Dodgers do have a good 5th starter, whether it's Urias or May or Gonsolin or whoever, we'll get to that in a moment. And this might be controversial, but if it's game 5, I would feel better with Kershaw on short rest than I would have either of those guys. So that's number 2. Buehler, and this is, I'll say, this is a big deal. Buehler can't go on short rest. He's got a blister issue. So if he pitches game 1, the Dodgers have to go to either their 5th starter or a bullpen game in game 5. Now, third, and this is the other key point, the Padres are simply worse against left-handed pitchers than they are against right-handed pitchers. So far this season, against lefties, they're hitting 250. Righties, they're hitting 259. Against lefties, they hit a home run in 2.8% of at-bats. Against righties, it's almost double that at about 5. They strike out 26% of the time against lefties, 23.5% against righties. So I think that's a big deal. They are worse against lefties. Kershaw, obviously a lefty. Buehler, obviously a righty. And so I think that's a big deal. I think that matters, and I think that's a big thing to consider. The last thing I'll throw out there, how have these guys fared against San Diego? Both of them have 1 start against the Padres. Kershaw, 6 1/3, 5 hits, 3 earned runs, no walks, 9 strikeouts. This was on September 14th. You and I did a live post-game show. Now, you might hear that and say 6 1/3, 3 earned runs. What are we talking about here? Well, consider this was the game when Kershaw left with runners on first and second and 1 out, and Baez came in. This was Muncy with 1, maybe 2 errors. Treinen collapses. And again, the 7th inning, infield single, pop-up, line single. Kershaw gets pulled. Baez gives up a bloop double. Muncy error, infield single, seeing eye single, ground out pickoff. So kind of a disaster to get to 3 earned runs for Kershaw there. Buehler, this was way back in August. This was his 2nd start of the year. 5 innings, 3 hits, 3 earned, 3 walkouts, 3 walks, 3 strikeouts. So 3s all across the board. He gave up home runs to Tatis, to Myers, and to Grisham. So that's sort of just a data point. I'm not saying we look at those 2 and say that makes it easy, but I'll also just throw in, I mean, Kershaw was dominant in his last. Buehler was good, but not great. So that's why, for me, Kershaw is game 1, and I'll throw in there, I think Kershaw is game 5 if they need it. My guess, I'm in the minority there, but what do you think? Am I in the minority there, and do you agree?
I think you have to at least give yourself that option. I mean, they're both going to be coming in on enough rest to pitch game 1, so it's not a sense of you go Buehler game 1 just because you had Buehler game 1 of the last series. You could go either one of them game 1 this series and they're on full rest, and even if you push Buehler back to game 2, that gives him extra rest, which can only be a good thing for his blister to give that an extra day. So I think that's a reason to go Kershaw as well. But you have to give yourself that option to at least – you got one guy on this staff that could throw on 3 days rest. Why not throw him game 1 so you have the ability to bring him back on game 5 if you want to? So for that reason alone, it makes sense to go Kershaw in game 1. And then you factor in how great he just looked in his last start. He's throwing the ball real well right now. He's probably itching to get up back on that mound as soon as possible. So yeah, for all the reasons you laid out, I'm going Kershaw in game 1, no questions asked.
Oh man, see, I thought I was gonna be in the minority. We were gonna have not even with you, but just in Dodger fans in general. I mean, people would be afraid of playoff Kershaw and that whole deal.
Right, but the way I see it, they're both starting game 1 or game 2. They're both starting a game. Like, the order doesn't matter as much to me. So why not go with the guy in game 1 who has the ability to pitch on short rest, just in case you want to bring him back for game 5. Maybe you have to, maybe Urias has to pitch out of the bullpen in game 3 or 4 and can't start game 5. So you want to leave all options on the table.
Yeah, and so, I mean, on that front, we'll get to game 3 and 4 in a moment, but let's say Kershaw pitches game 1 and pitches well. 6 innings, 7 innings, 1 earned, 2 earned, 8 strikeouts. I mean, impressive, win or lose. They get to a game 5. Are you, like, if he does that in game 1, are you just planning for Kershaw as my game 5 starter? I mean, again, it's one less day of rest than sort of quote unquote normal. Are you going Kershaw in game 5?
Yeah, I am. And the reason is just because his workload has been so low this year that it's not like he had a 200 inning regular season and now it's the NLDS and you need him to go on short rest already. His arm feels good. He's rested. He's ready to go. And I also loved the way Urias looked out of the bullpen. So if you could potentially use him as a super reliever in 2 or 3 games of this series, and that takes him out of the rotation, obviously, then you could bring Kershaw back on short rest. I think that's a huge bonus, just having that arm available in your bullpen on top of everyone else as well.
Yeah, and so we're in agreement there. I mean, I guess I'm not totally surprised. I assumed that there might be disagreement there. But so game 3 and game 4, though, I think we are going to have some disagreement based on what you just said. So game 3 and game 4 for you are Gonsolin and May?
Yeah, I'm not too crazy about the order. I'd probably go Gonsolin game 3 just because he's been slightly better. And then I'd go May game 4. Do you have Julio in one of those spots?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've got Julio in game 4, kind of for the reasons I mentioned. I think the left-hander is an advantage over the Padres. I think he looked good in round 1, which makes me feel better about putting him out there in round 2, whereas a guy like May, we just haven't seen. And also, I just think May's stuff plays up a little bit more out of the bullpen compared to some of the rest of these guys. I think his sinker ball would be nice. I think his velocity would be nice. Whereas a guy like Julio, you've got plenty of left-handed arms out there, Kolarek, McGee, etc. And, I mean, he's not throwing 98, 99. He's touching 94, 95, maybe 96. But so for me, I think Gonsolin in game 3, I think, as you said, he's been the Dodgers' 3rd best pitcher. And I think because he's a lefty and because we've already seen him do it in the playoffs, I think I'd go Urias in game 4.
Yeah, that's fair. And like we've talked about a lot, all 3 of the Dodgers' young starters have been great.
Yeah.
So they all have legitimate cases to pitch in a game 3. The only reason I went with Julio out of the bullpen is because he has the most experience in that role. I'm not sure if May would be able to, pitch 2 innings in game 2 and then come back after 1 day of rest and do the same thing in game 4.
Yeah.
I think I'd feel more comfortable with Julio doing something like that. So that's the only reason I went with him. But I think if you weighed out the innings, I would have them all pitching around the same amount of innings in the series, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I would just have Julio spread out across 2 or 3 games.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, I mean, all these guys have faced San Diego already. Dustin May had 2 starts. 11 and a third total innings, 8 hits, 5 earned runs, 3 walks, 3 home runs, and 8 strikeouts. So pretty pedestrian. He was the worst of the 3 against the Padres this year. Gonsolin had 2 starts, 11 2/3 innings, 7 hits, 1 earned run, 1 walk, no home runs, 10 strikeouts. So that included, 4 2/3, 8 strikeouts back in August. And then Urias on August 13th, 6 1/3 innings, 5 hits, 2 earned runs, no walks, 2 home runs, 3 strikeouts. So it wasn't great, but at the end of the day, he got the win. And I'll add this about Urias. I mean, Urias has been sort of up and down, kind of a mercurial pitcher and sort of controversial in some circles about whether people are all in on Urias or think he's overrated. I mean, his last 3 starts before the playoffs, 17 2/3, 7 hits, 4 earned runs, no home runs allowed, 10 strikeouts. You add in 3 innings pitched, 3 hits, no earned runs, 5 strikeouts in the playoffs. I mean, you're talking about a guy that's gone 20 innings pitched with 4 earned runs, striking out almost a batter an inning, giving up less than 1 base runner an inning. So he has been pretty good. And again, I'll just say it again. The Padres hit lefties worse than they hit righties. I think that's the tiebreaker for me.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And Julio's looked great over the last month or so.
Yeah.
So I think any question marks I had about him, maybe at the midway point of the season, I don't have anymore. I fully trust him. So I expect him to pitch a lot in the series, whether he's starting or relieving. I like what I've seen out of Julio.
And I take it, I mean, all 5 of those guys you would prefer as a starting pitcher over a bullpen game. Is that fair?
Yeah, you could go with the opener in one of those games. Maybe if you don't want May facing Tatis and Machado in the first inning, maybe you bring out a Gratterall to start and then go to May after that. I think that would make some sense just because of how San Diego constructs their lineup. They have the big righties at the top. So I think that's something to consider, but I don't think I would do a full-on bullpen game just because you need these guys for 5 days in a row. You can't just be taxing your bullpen in one specific game.
Yeah, it would be interesting. Maybe Gratterall in the first inning and then Urias coming in after him. You get the lefty, a guy who has historically struggled, a guy who you've seen him come out in the third inning and do well. And that might be an interesting way to construct things for sure. So, well, moving from the pitching staff to the roster itself. Same number of players are allowed. It is a 5-game series versus a 3-game series. And I'll prompt it with the question we got on Twitter. This is from Grafixa. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. But they ask, will Gavin Lux play in the Padres series? Which I read this as, are there any changes to your playoff roster, Daniel? Is Gavin Lux getting a spot? Is Dylan Floro getting a spot? Is Alex Wood getting a spot? Are there any guys that get added or taken off in your estimation?
Yeah, I would make one change. It would not be Gavin Lux. He just didn't prove enough this year. There's no clear role for him.
Yeah.
Maybe if there wasn't a universal DH and it was still traditional National League Baseball, then you could carry that extra position player. But with the DH, the change I would make is I would get rid of Matt Beatty. There's just kind of similar to Lux. There's just no role for him. He's not the first option as a pinch hitter. He's not good enough defensively to be a defensive replacement. So I don't really see a clear path for him to get playing time. So I would drop him, and then I'd add Dylan Floro just to get the extra arm in there. Like we said, 5 straight days with the game.
Yeah.
You don't want to run out of pitching so you can have an extra guy on the end of the bench in case you need a pinch hitter, which you won't because there's a DH. So I'm adding Floro. He's been great this year. He absolutely deserves a spot. We thought he deserved a spot on the wild card roster, but at the end of the day, we also said it's only 3 games, so it was fine carrying one less pitcher. But I would add one more pitcher now for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, I agree with you. I think in 2 games, the Dodgers used 1 pinch hitter, I believe. Jock Peterson came in for A.J. Pollock, and then Kike Hernandez was a defensive replacement. So we're talking about 2 guys off the bench, which meant there were a number of guys that went unused. And the same for the bullpen. I mean, they used what? Three relievers in game 1 and 1 in game 2. So you're talking about 6 total pitchers that got used. We were making a big deal about whether they would carry 13 or 14. I guess it didn't really matter at the end of the day. At least Victor Gonzalez got to warm up. So, I mean, he kind of considers their part counts there. But, yeah, I mean, I'm with you. Dylan Floro, to me, has to be on the roster. I just think he's good. I mean, I don't think he's going to be a difference maker unless it's like a 14th inning of a game and he gets put in. Obviously, they view him as the last guy off the bench. Maybe they would bring him in earlier because of a righty-righty matchup or something like that. But I just think he's good. I mean, I think the Dodgers' 14th pitcher is way better than anybody else's 14th pitcher. Now, let me ask this. Why Matt Beatty and not Terrence Gore? Terrence Gore was on the wild card roster for me, and I just don't – I mean, it felt like a luxury item of like, well, we have this roster spot we don't really care about, so sure, throw the speedy guy in there. To me, it feels like I just don't see a scenario where that matters as much as – I mean, I hear you on will they ever get to the last batter? Probably not, so maybe that's the answer. But I guess my default would be Terrence Gore. You know I'm not a big Matt Beatty guy, so if you're going to take him off, so be it. Like, I'm not going to complain there, but – for me, I would just probably lean Gore because I just don't see the end of the day value. Although, I mean, maybe I'm talking myself into it. I guess if it's a late game and you've got Justin Turner on third base with 1 out and you need 1 run, I mean, maybe Gore is the guy there. Beatty's not going to be. I guess you could put Kike in, but I don't know. I'm talking myself in circles. Is it clear for you, Beatty over Gore?
You kind of just laid out the reasons why I would keep Gore over Beatty. You're absolutely right. He is a luxury item. But when he's the last guy on the bench, why not have a guy who actually serves a purpose? I could see there being a scenario where there's a guy on second, 2 outs, and you want to get a fast guy in there, or you get a leadoff guy on, and he's the tying run, and maybe a pinch run for Austin Barnes or something, and Gore goes in and steals a base, a la Dave Roberts in the 2004 ALCS. So I think Gore could serve a specific purpose, whereas Matt Beatty, in my opinion, is just going to be sitting on the bench. A lot would have to go wrong for him to be getting in a bat in a game. There would have to be, multiple injuries.
Yeah.
So I don't expect that to be the case, and that's why I would go Gore. And same thing for Keibert Ruiz, just because if you're going to have Barnes starting some games and Will Smith DHing, I do think there is a purpose for having a third catcher, even though he probably won't see any game action either. A lot would have to go wrong for him to see some game action. But I just think guys like that could actually, in theory, serve a purpose, whereas Matt Beatty, I don't really see what he's going to be bringing to the table.
Yeah, and it is interesting. Usually you look at the bench and you say, well, do they really need Terrence Gore because they've got so-and-so who's got speed and can use as a pinch runner. But if Kike Hernandez is going to be a late-inning defensive replacement at second base, which it appears that he has been, besides Kike, I mean, they have no speed. Beatty is not quick. Jock Peterson is not quick. Keibert Ruiz is not quick. Edwin Rios, if he's not playing, is not quick. So, I mean, it does feel like if you need a pinch runner. Now, the flip side is, who are the guys that would need to be run for? Justin Turner's a name that comes to mind. I'm not sure if there's really Edwin Rios, I suppose. I mean, some of these guys run okay, but are you really going to take Justin Turner out in a tie game because you want to pinch run for him? I mean, I suppose if the situation presented itself. But, yeah, I think you've convinced me. I think I would go Beatty, take Beatty off and leave Gore on just because. And, I mean, Beatty's not great, and it's 1 at-bat, so even if Gore needed to hit, I mean, he is worse than Beatty, but in, like, 1 at-bat, which is, like, a unbelievable scenario that it happens. Like, I'm not sure there's a massive difference between those two guys as well when things play out. So that is interesting. But yeah, I'm with you. I mean, as far as the hitters, I mean, none of these guys or the pitchers, nobody did anything wrong enough to justify changing things. Like, who is Gavin Lux going and taking us? But what has changed in the last week for a guy like Gavin Lux? I think the only way you would do something differently is if you wanted to add another pitcher, which we predict, or another hitter, which wouldn't make any sense. But that would be the only thing. Now, for you, lineup-wise, they had Rios in there in Game 1. They had Will Smith DHing in Game 2. Again, small sample size. Each guy only got 1 game. Do you change anything on that front, righty or lefty, or Austin Barnes in versus not in?
I think the reason Edwin Rios was in there as the DH was because the Brewers had a lefty on the mound. So when a lefty's on the mound, Jock's just not in the lineup.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to see in a non-Kershaw game where Will Smith is catching and a righty's on the mound. I do think they'll go to Jock as the DH over Rios in that specific scenario. And with Clevenger and Lamet and Paddock and Davies, all 4 of them are righties. So San Diego doesn't have any lefty starters. So I think we'll see Jock in the lineup a few games this series. At least Game 1. Well, if Kershaw's pitching, we won't see him Game 1 because then it'll be Barnes. And I thought that was fine. Barnes actually came through.
Yeah,
so
you don't have Barnes as your everyday DH yet? What's going on?
Not yet, but him and Kershaw have a good rapport. 8 shutout innings, so I'm definitely not going away from there. But But I think in a game two scenario where Will Smith is catching and a righty's on the mound, I think Jock will be the DH in that game.
Still no Austin Barr. I mean, guy was 2 for 3. He had the go-ahead RBI, single up the middle. I mean, come on now.
Credit to him. I'm not pressing my luck too much though. He has not reached the level of everyday lineup guy for me yet.
Yeah, and I mean,
But when Kershaw pitches, fine.
Yeah,
fine.
And I mean, Rios, like you said, I mean, the stat line didn't end up being good. I don't think he got a hit, got on base at all. But I mean, he almost hit a home run. You kind of like hinted at what is there. You know, Jock had his one pinch hit appearance. That was my prediction for the Dodgers home run. I predicted a pinch hit in the 8th. He was pinch hitting in the 7th. So I was close. And then somebody joked with me on Twitter because I was like, oh, look at this. I was 1 inning off. Here comes Jock. And then the first pitch, he squares like he's going to bunt. And I'm like, oh, good God. I tweeted that too early. But thankfully, he was just faking it. But it didn't end up coming to anything. So, yeah, I think we're on the same page there. I think the lineup generally stays the same. Maybe Jock goes in for Rios depending on the handedness, but it feels like that would be the only change. I mean, Pollock wasn't great. Chris Taylor was, but both of those guys still feel like every day. Nobody, you know, it's not like Jock hit a home run and all of a sudden, or Edwin Rios went 2 for 4 and you got to do something different. So, well, let's end with this. We did this last round and I think it's helpful. It's Dodgers win if ... and Dodgers lose if ... So, and then we'll get to our predictions and we'll close out the show that way. And let's start on the negative front. For you, as you think about this series, what would have to go wrong in order for the Dodgers to lose this series?
I think for the Dodgers to lose this series is if their bats just go quiet. Yeah. We know the pitching for the Dodgers is going to be at least solid, if not great. They're facing a tough lineup in the Padres, who I think the Padres are going to score some runs this series. So if the Dodgers are able to come out and be the Dodgers, then I think they'll be fine. But if this is a case of what we've seen in past postseasons where the bats just go completely quiet, then I think this could be a scenario where we see them go home early. I do not think they swung it well enough in that Brewers series. They did what they had to do. They're facing a bad offense in the Brewers, so they knew they didn't need to score a whole lot. But I think they're going to have to be better in this series, and I think they will be. We saw the Cardinals, like you said, put up 16 runs against this Padres pitching staff, and the Cardinals have maybe one guy who would be in the Dodgers lineup, and that's Paul Goldschmidt. Other than that, the Cardinals just have a bunch of mediocre offensive guys, and they were scoring. So I think the only way the Dodgers lose this series is if Bellinger and Seager and all those guys just do what we've seen in past postseasons, where they just, you know, go completely quiet, strike out, swing at those breaking balls at their feet. Stuff like that, which, you know, I'm hoping isn't the case.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, that's the big one for me. I'll throw this out there as a secondary one. For the Dodgers lose if, the Padres seem to me to be a momentum team. They're a team that it's very like they get on runs. Like one guy hits a home run and then another guy hits a home run. And then all of a sudden it's just like an avalanche where you just feel like the world is coming down on you. And so the Dodgers lose this series if things get out of control, I think, in game 1 and game 2. I think if the Padres are able to hit 5-6 home runs in the first 2 games, I think that's going to be trouble because I think they're going to believe really, really quickly that they can win this series. They're going to believe that, you know, it's like almost like they haven't been there long enough to understand how difficult the mountain is that they're facing. And so if they don't get a sense, if they don't get put in their place really early on in the series, I think that's trouble. So for me, the Dodgers lose if the Padres get some momentum at the plate early and often in games 1 and game 2, and I think it could be trouble from there. So that's the lose if. Now let's
real quick, just one more little rebuttal to that. What you said is completely fair, and it's definitely a concern. But I think in every single series the Dodgers and the Padres played this season, I think the Padres won the first game every time. And they got, you know, their team and their fans got all high and mighty. We remember that night when they celebrated winning the World Series. They invaded our show, and then after that, the Dodgers won 2 straight. That's kind of how every series won.
Yeah.
So I think the Dodgers have been pretty good with their backs against the wall this year. So I wouldn't be too concerned with the game 1. But I mean, if you go down 0-2, all bets are off as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Now let's flip to the positive. Daniel, in your estimation, the Dodgers win this series if?
Though I'm going back to the bats again. I think that's kind of what it comes down to. If the Dodgers offense is doing what they do best, if they're working counts, getting the starters pitch counts up, we've seen this Padres bullpen is already, they've been worked a lot.
Yeah.
And then they're going to be playing 5 straight days. So if you get it into that bullpen early in the series, I think each day that just bodes well for you more and more going forward. The Dodgers have a lot more pitching depth than the Padres right now, and we'll see about Lamet and Clevenger. I honestly have no clue what they're going to bring to the series, if anything.
Yeah.
So we'll see with them. But if the Dodgers are working counts, taking walks, getting the pitch count up, I think they'll be in a good spot.
Yeah, mine's kind of along the same lines. On one hand, the Dodgers will win this series if they dominate the bullpen matchup. We know the Dodgers have the better bullpen. We know the Dodgers have a tendency to get into and then get to bullpens of opposing teams. But the question is, can they do it enough? I mean, if the Dodgers can keep Padres starters to 5 innings or less, and they're forcing the Padres to get 4 innings out of their bullpen day after day after day, by the time you get to game 3 and game 4, the Padre bullpen is going to be a mess. On the flip side, the Dodgers have 9 guys they can trust. So the Dodger bullpen, in theory, won't get worn out. And so if the Dodgers can get into the Padre bullpen early and often, even if they don't see results in game 1 or even game 2, you know that's going to pay dividends. And the second thing I would add, just with that in mind, the Dodgers are going to outpitch the Padres. Like, from a talent perspective, the question is, can the bats hang? The Dodgers don't need necessarily to out-hit. Like, they don't need to just completely dominate the Padre hitters. They just need to keep pace, because if the Dodgers can go home run for home run with the Padres, we know that at the end of the day, the Dodger starters, the Dodger bullpen is going to be better. And so I think that's a big thing. If the Dodger bats can get going in the form of home runs and keep things on track, then I think it comes down to a pitching matchup, and I think that one goes easily to the Dodgers.
Yeah, I think the pitching advantage is huge in favor of the Dodgers, and that's even if Lamet and Clevenger pitch. Those are 2 great pitchers, no doubt, but we don't know what their health status is. We don't know what type of length they would be able to give, even if they pitch. So I think the Dodgers offense is in a good spot where they're going to be facing some tired arms by games 3 and 4 of the series. And even if they drop one of the first 2 games, I think later on in the series, we'll see, the dividends start to be paid.
Yeah. Well, then let's close it out. Your prediction: the Dodgers are playing the Padres. How many games? Who wins?
I'm going Dodgers in 4. I have a lot of respect for this Padres team. That's why I'm going to give them a game and not going to call it a sweep. But I think this is kind of similar to 2017 when the Diamondbacks were the hot team that everyone thought would beat the Dodgers. They had their number in the regular season, and then we just saw the Dodgers kick it up a gear in the postseason, and they swept them. So I'm expecting a similar type of series as that. Maybe the Padres bats get hot for a night. Tatis hits 2 homers or something, and they get a game. But I'm going Dodgers in 4. Yeah. Dodgers in 4.
So for me, I've got the Dodgers winning the series. I'm going to put a caveat on this and say, if Clevenger and Lamet are not on the postseason roster, I think the Dodgers sweep. I think it'll just be a death blow. I think the Padres will put their best starter out in game 1. I think he's going to get knocked around, and I think the Padres are going to look down the line and say, we have Zach Davies in game 2. We have no idea who's pitching game 3. We have no idea who's pitching game 4. How in the world are we going to win 3 of the next 4? If Clevenger and Lamet do pitch, I think the Padres get 1, and I think the Dodgers win in 4. I just think one of those guys probably gives you something. The other guy is probably a mess, and then you're still in the same spot where Paddock isn't great. You have no idea who's going in game 4, and you have no idea who's going in game 5. To try and throw a bullpen game in game 4 or game 5 after 3 consecutive days, I mean, I just don't see where they find the arms to do it. And so I think things favor the Dodgers on all fronts. I think the question is, that's never been the issue. The issue has never been who's the better team for the Dodgers.
Yeah.
The issue has been, can they produce? I think it does help the Dodgers. They've seen the Padres this year. I think a guy like Turner, who struggled in the first round, I think the fact that he's going to be seeing pitchers that he's seen 20 to 30 times already this year, not to mention years past, is going to get a veteran guy like him going. Muncy could probably say the same thing. And so I think that's helpful. But yeah, I mean, I feel good if I'm the Dodgers going into this. I think the 5 games in 5 days is weirdly a massive advantage for the Dodgers, one they weren't planning on, but it is an advantage. And so at the end of the day, I think the Dodgers win. So yeah, well, that'll do it for us tonight. Check out DodgerBlue.com, DodgerBlue1958 on all the social media channels for updates as we head to the Dodgers. Of course, at some point will release who's going to start in game 1. they'll release their playoff roster. The Padres will be doing the same. So check out DodgerBlue.com for the updates on that. And then stay tuned to our channel, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, because we are going to be doing live post games. Some of it depends on the Lakers schedule, because we know most of you all, like us, are watching both of those series simultaneously. But we are going to be doing some live recaps this series, and we've got some hats to give away. We're going to do some giveaways as well. Super great hats. So stay tuned for details about that. But with that, tonight, that is it. We appreciate you all watching. We'll see you this week as the Dodgers take on the Padres in the NLDS. Have a good one.